You got me again this week. So I'm Kat. I'm one of the research physios working under Prof Griffin. And I'm going to talk to you about ethical approval, which is very exciting. Have you done ethics for things generally before?
Not really, no.
No? Okay. Anyone online done any ethics applications before? Feels like talking. I feel like I'm talking to a ghost. It's really I'm like slightly mad. Okay, well, I'll just get cracking. So we're talking about the necessary steps for ethical approval. A little bit of the background I'm going to just talk through first, and then I've tried to keep it as practical as I can. So I'll try to just talk through what you actually need to do and what the practical implications of what you do, how they transpire into research. So I spent some time Googling the history of ethics, and this is like a really tiny percentage of the amount of like crazy things that have happened in the history of ethics. And that's even like I've not even gone any further back than 1932 here. And I think like, if you guys know any of these events, then I think it tells you a lot about why people might be suspicious of research and why, particular groups might feel more likely to be victimised and vulnerable groups. So it kind of goes through everything from, I don't actually know I was meant to Google how to pronounce it because I've been in my head been saying the Tuskegee trial, but it's probably something else. And then how we've sort of developed over time, and we've developed different safeguards and different rulings for how ethics should be conducted. But then actually we still have some things that go wrong, like even up to last year when the idea of expediting research papers to be published actually led to some being retracted because they weren't peer reviewed appropriately. And then the confusion and the misinformation wheel that started out as a result of that. So you don't really get a lot of leeway to make mistakes when it comes to ethics, but then ethics is also very complicated and very situation dependent. So it's a really tricky one, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, do you guys know about this study in America that happened? It's quite famously quoted in presentations like this. But it's quite a shocker, and it really actually is quite upsetting to think that. So this was a study into syphilis that started in 1932, and at the time they didn't have a good treatment for it, so they didn't actually know what the best way of treating it was. They did all kinds of things wrong that we would never do today, which was they recruited almost 400 men and 200 that were a control group. So about 400 African American men who were diagnosed with syphilis. They weren't told that that's what they had, and they were thought they were being given a treatment. So if you look at like patient encounters, like reports that they gave, they were being given like a little vial of something, and they thought they were getting some sort of treatment for something called bad blood. And in 1945, so quite a while after it first started, the penicillin treatment was widely known to be effective, and these patients were still not treated. They were even followed to doctors to make sure they didn't get treated. And personally, I don't really understand the point. It sounds like they wanted to follow these patients until they died, and then look at their bodies after they've died to see what the disease process had been with this particular illness. What they, from a doctor's sort of standpoint, or from a healthcare standpoint, what you gain from doing that, I don't know. So effectively, the study was stopped in 1972 after investigative journalists exposed them, essentially, and said these men are not being treated with something that's widely known to be effective. And it took until 1997 for them to be issued an apology and issued any kind of compensation to the families. So it's a really, really dark past, I think, and it's something that I think it gives me a lot of, you can never understand, but you can see why people would be mistrustful of research and researchers, especially like this is so recent, you know, it's like really not that long ago. So the Declaration of Helsinki came into effect in 1964, so this is before the end of that trial, sadly, which means it didn't quite come off as sort of stopping this thing happening. But it's not actually law. It's just it's something from the World Medical Association. They adopted these principles, and these are like meant to be the minimum principles. So if you've got higher standards of law in your country that you live, then obviously the higher standard or the stricter standard applies. And then essentially that's just a few highlights. It's just that the health of my patient will be my first consideration, and the physician will always act in the patient's best interest. And the document is not as long as you think. It should be read in full, and I would recommend reading it in full because you can see how the different policies and procedures that we have in research are connected to it. So it's quite useful to read through. I'm going to go through a lot of it, but not every single section because we'd be bored to tears of my voice. So, in a nutshell, designing research is, it's our responsibility. It's the only way that we can progress medical care is to design robust and well-designed research. So that is something that we need to do, but we need to do it in a way that protects people's health and their human rights. The other thing is that when we do design it, we shouldn't take interventions as finished. So it should be a case of anything that you're offering as a new intervention or a new treatment, you have to kind of go, right, what is the best standard of care that we've got? Is this going to be better? Because there's no point trying to do something substandard unless you're in a situation where you haven't got that best because of resources for some reason. And you should really, the placebo should be used when there's no best proven intervention. So you don't really want to be giving people nothing if you know that there is a treatment of some description. Your oversight of your study has to be carried out by someone appropriately trained. So that's where our chief investigators and our principal investigators comes in. So that's why you have your oversight by somebody who is qualified to look at and keep an eye on it all. And that is their responsibility to make sure that what's being practiced out there under the name of that particular study is being done right. And then all research activity obviously has to be completed by people that have done GCP training, and that's really easy to access and do, but then you need to do the trial-specific training and then be delegated by the person who's running the trial. So the person that's running the trial has to sign you off and say, yes, I am happy for you to do that. And that is in the Declaration of Helsinki, which I actually didn't realise until I went through it. And I went, oh, that's basically what that's talking about. So obviously it's too big for me to fit into one slide. It's got a point about it being inclusive and representing everybody, but what you have to be careful of is your vulnerable groups. Your vulnerable groups are more likely people that are maybe more vulnerable to being mistreated. So if you're designing research that's proven like to benefit that particular group, you're okay, but then you still need to prove that you're going to benefit that particular group, and you cannot do that research with people that aren't in that vulnerable group. So if you're doing something about risk fractures for people who have a learning disability, are they different enough? Is the study being designed are they different enough as a population for you not to be able to do that in people that are not potentially considered vulnerable? So it's that difference, it's that difficulty between including and representing everybody, but also making sure you're not putting anybody at risk. So you need to I've kind of given that example as quite flippantly, and it depends on obviously all the different capacity and consenting processes that you've got involved as well, which I'll go through at the end. So appropriate sponsorship is important because you need financial management. If you're getting grants from public money, you need good financial management that is open. You also need insurance for your participants, so you need to be able to show how they're insured. So if they do complain and they need compensation, they've got some recourse to get that. Risk, burdens, benefits, you all know really well from doing patient consenting. You have to explain those to patients. But they also have to be carefully evaluated and presented in an ethics panel. You have to be able to show that you've considered as much as you possibly can. And you have to show how you're going to monitor it as well. So you have to say, like, what are considered adverse events? What's considered a serious adverse event? What is an expected event? What's, how are your DMEC going, your data monitoring and ethics committee? They're going to regularly review it and keep an eye on all of your AEs that are reported. So what are going to be your red lights? What are going to be your stop signs that say, look, this is not safe, or this is not working, or we need to change something, so that you don't have that thing that you had in that American study that I can't pronounce. That you're not having that kind of process of, we're just going to carry on regardless of the fact that we know that this is unsafe. So I promise this is the last bit about this, is you have to make sure it's based on solid foundation and it's not repeating or duplicating something that's already been done, because that's a waste of everybody's time and it's not fair on participants as well. And you have to disclose how it's being funded, where your affiliations are. If you've got any conflict of interest, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, because you might have a reason why you're trying to develop a particular product. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and you're trying to test that thing, but you need to declare it so people can see. So people can see what happened. I used the Andy Wakefield MMR jab as an example. He did not disclose his affiliations, his conflict of interest. He wanted to market a sort of broken down version of the MMR, which was going to make him a fortune. And this is ultimately why his paper was eventually withdrawn, because all of the work that he'd done was just not open, it wasn't transparent, and it caused a lot of people to then be sceptical of having the MMR vaccine on no grounds. It put a lot of people at risk. So it's really important for people to be able to understand and see those affiliations. And then you've got to submit it to an ethics committee. So I'll talk a bit more about that and how you're going to monitor it, and what that ethics committee is going to do. About privacy and confidentiality, and obviously the trial has to be registered before recruitment starts. And that's something so that it just means it's all really transparent and all really open and people know what's happening. And making sure that you publish inconclusive or negative results, because obviously that goes back to your literature. So if somebody's done that and put patients through something that was then not successful or didn't work, then you need to either improve on that or change that. So not publishing or not having that out there means that progress is limited, and it potentially means more patients are going to do the same thing again, which is unnecessary. And then you've got to go through informed consent, but I'll do that separately. So if you're trying to get ethical approval for something, this is where you've got to start. You've got to start with, is it research? Let's just assume it is. And then you've got to say, do you need NHS rec review or proportionate review? Generally speaking, I think everyone in this room, for most things, you're going to need NHS rec review if you're going to do something that's going to be affecting NHS patients. So that's what I've focused on. Everything else is all available on the HRA decisions tool. So if you need to go into more detail, then just go there. So if you're going to go for NHS rec, you need to go to IRAS. I promise it's not as bad as you think. Everyone's like, oh no, IRAS, I'm going to die. So these are the sorts of things that it will ask you for, and it is all literally just there for you. So you tick the box of whether you're doing any of these things, and it will give you the appropriate forms, and then you just have to answer the questions. It's that simple. It's all automated, and it's on one system. You don't have to do anything elsewhere. So you have to know if it's a CTIMP or a non-CTIMP study. I'll make you go to GCP if you don't know what those two things are. Non-CE marked or off-label use of CE marked devices, any kind of ionising radiation. You need to know which country you want to recruit patients in, and if you want to do, like for example, Scotland's got different rules about capacity. If you're treating patients without capacity in your study, anything where you're collecting tissue or using the biobanks or genetic information and databases as well. There are different rules for people who are offenders. You have to go through the prison service. There's an extra form for that. There's something, I haven't really looked into this, somebody might be able to tell me, but there is something about people who are actually in prison have slightly different ability to consent for themselves. Can't remember what it is. Might be something for people to look up or tell me if they know. And the newest thing is if you're trying to do something for COVID-19, which is vaccine, treatment or diagnostic or transmission related, then you can go through a fast track review, which apparently you get a review within a week. Yeah, I'm sure, right. Which, when you think about it, when everyone got really up in arms about why research has come out so quickly, it's normally, it takes more, I don't know how many weeks for you to get a validation letter, and then it takes 60 days for you to get a response. So you do your application, you do your IRS application, and you need to have all these documents. So you need your protocol, you need your PIS, you need your consent forms, you need any patient-facing documents. The rec needs to read them all, and they need to see them and say, right, yeah, they're all good. Once you've submitted, you're supposed to get a validation letter. And then once you get a validation letter, you book your meeting, and then you've got 60 days from a validated application to getting a rec opinion. So you can see, like, that's 2 months. So possibly 3 months at the fastest possible speed if you can really, really knock it out of the park. But you know, for something to get you an opinion or get you into a rec in a week, that's quite a big deal. So that is different, and I think that's probably why there's a backlog. If anyone's waiting for ethics, there's a backlog for other things. So in terms of informed consent, you all know how to take informed consent. I'm not going to tell you about how to do that. I don't know about the guys online if you have done any consenting for trials, but obviously there's sort of these 3 kind of core different approaches in my opinion, but if anyone's got any others, feel free to shout them out. So there's informed consent, where you're getting informed consent from the patient themselves, and you have a consultee agreement where the ideal approach is that you get a personal consultee. That's not always possible, especially in an A&E setting where, you know, there's no one contactable and it's you've got to do it quick. So then the second best is a professional nominated consultee. They have to have read some information about the study. They have to be separate from the study, so they can't be like your CI or your PI. They can't be anybody that's actually doing recruitment for the trial. They have to be a separate professional, and they have to be somebody who has responsibility for the patient, who is invested in that patient's care. It can't just be like a random nurse that you found that was walking along the corridor in A&E. Oh, you'd be the nominated person. It has to be someone that's actually looking after that patient. So the idea is that they act as the best interest representative of that patient. And then usually if that patient regains the ability to consent, you would then go back to them to get their informed consent. If they are somebody that generally doesn't have capacity to consent for themselves, then that will stand throughout, but you should be continually checking. So every time you do a follow-up, you should be checking. Pediatric consent can get complicated, and I'm not really an expert in this, but anyone under 16 needs somebody with legal responsibility to provide consent. Usually it's good practice to get assent from the child, so the child is basically you explain to them what you're doing, and you make sure that they understand, essentially, and you just say, is that okay? If they're very young and you think that conversation is going to be upsetting because they're not going to understand, or what you're talking about is maybe just not going to kind of get through to them, then it might not be necessary or appropriate. So it is very much case dependent on what you're talking about at the time. I think, like with the orthotics study that we did with print, most of the children were a little bit older and they'd had experience of wearing orthotics themselves, and we wanted to hear from them about what they liked about the orthotics, what they didn't like about them. So actually getting assent from them and parental or legal consent was relatively easy, because they understood what that thing on their leg was for and how they wore it and that sort of thing. So that was something that they could really understand when you explained it to them and you showed them pictures of it. That some other procedures might be a bit more abstract and a bit harder to explain to them, and it might cause them upset if they don't understand, or they don't, so it does just depend on a case-by-case basis. And then everyone will have heard of Gillick competency. So I think the probably best practice for this, personally, is if that young person between 16 to 18 doesn't feel able to consent for themselves and would like a legal representative to help them, then that's probably the most appropriate way. That every effort should be made for anybody over 16, every effort should be made for them to consent for themselves. And usually they should be able to, unless they're sort of falling into one of the other vulnerable groups. Does that all make sense? And then we've got capacity. So I've just put the slide up, but everyone can kind of, do you all make decisions about capacity? Like, generally when you go to a patient, do you?
I think it's something that we often do without thinking about quite so formally.
Yeah, I think so. I think most people, these sort of 3 points from the Mental Capacity Act are things that we do all the time, like you say, without really thinking about it. But it's quite interesting when you're documenting for research, is to make sure that if you decide that somebody does not have capacity to consent and you go for a consultee or a different way of consenting, I think something that we can forget to do is to make sure that you document why you made that decision. Because capacity, as it says at the top, capacity is time and decision specific. And because you need to be able to reassess it, you need to be able to show that that patient didn't understand the relevant information. Excuse me. They couldn't retain it. And read it. I can't speak anymore.
It becomes hard when you've got that capacity to make it anything but not something else. I think that's the.
Can't speak. Sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, so I can't speak, so you have to talk over the sound. Oh dear, I literally like go to outside that coughing fit. Alright.
When someone can make one decision about something but not something else, then that's a kind of.
It's a sure sign that I've spoken too much, isn't it? So yeah, you're trying to make sure that they understand, they retain, and they're using that information to weigh it up, and that they're not. None of those things can be missing, because as soon as one of those things goes. So I don't know what everyone else thinks, but how do you check those things? Like, what do you do? in practice to check those three things.
I tend to try and have like a quite general conversation of like how are you feeling, like sometimes ask people where they are or what happened to bring them to hospital, like something quite kind of general so you can start to get a bit of a feel of them and conversing with them.
They get suspicious that they're not asking questions.
Yeah.
They should have questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a very good point.
Or they're blind and saying yes, probably. They're like, oh, let me split this round, and they still say yes.
Do you routinely get people to repeat back or explain it back to you as well? Yeah.
Yeah. Quite often say, if you were going to tell a family member or friend what I just explained to try and help you make a decision, how would you explain it to them?
Yeah, I think you remember you saying that to me a little while ago, and I think that's a really neat way of asking someone, have you understood, without saying, have you understood? You know, like, is it, because if you're explaining what the process is, and especially when it comes to a concept like randomization, where often people think they're asked to choose a particular treatment, and the randomization process is a really tricky one to explain, because you don't want to put people off of, you know, by saying it's you know, there's certain phrases that turn people off, like it's computer generated, or it's like flipping a coin, or anything which makes it sound like a really flippant, poorly considered decision about their healthcare. That's not what it is, but trying to explain the concept of it could be either way. So usually what I like to say is that both are good choices and both have been considered appropriate for your care. We don't know which one is best, so we need equal groups of people having each. We can't choose that for you. We have to allocate you without us knowing to make that a fair process. That's how I would normally explain it. Because then you're not saying, we haven't thought about this, we're just going to throw a coin in the air and hope for the best. But yeah. So I thought perhaps, I don't know if anyone wants to talk about any particular ethical issues that they've got with any particular study they're trying to design. If you've got any reflections on consent in practice that you want to talk through, or any difficult cases that you remember having of consenting a patient where it didn't quite go how you thought, if you feel comfortable talking about that, or if you want to just talk about generally what the differences are between consenting in practice and consenting in research. I didn't know what people would find most useful, so I just kind of put everything up there. Is there anything anyone wants to talk about in particular or to ask? If not, I'll just be quiet.
I've got just a quick question. Say you're trying to consent someone, but it's not like, for example, it's not between two treatments, it's just trying something new, like completely off that. Actually, to be fair, you kind of know that it's just like it's a bit far-fetched compared to what the other treatment is. How would you go about like people questioning like, oh, actually, this is very good for me?
How far-fetched are we talking?
Not obviously, like if you're doing research on it, you don't think it's completely gone, but I mean, just like, I guess even if you're fielding those questions, just like you can sense the person really isn't, they want to engage, but they're really unsure. How would you still be able to get them to consent?
Well, I mean, it depends on because obviously if that intervention, if you've got a basis to believe that intervention might be better and needs to be tested to be whether it's equivalent or better than the standard of care, then you need to be able to explain to that patient what the risks are and what the benefits are and what the potential outcomes are. If you don't have any of that, and if it's so new that you don't have that information, then you need to be really honest with them. And if they're not happy to consent because they're not game for it, if you like, then they're basically not a candidate for your study. It's not really any way you can talk them around that. If you if you go kind of like some of the first in man studies, for example, with new devices, I feel are a little bit like this. You have to really they have to understand the risks that they're undertaking, because obviously no study will get through ethics without it being, if you're trying to test a new device, a new implant, say, that device has to have had some level of proof that it's effective in healthy, willing volunteers before you start then bringing it to your patient group. If you start bringing it to your patient group because the first in man studies have gone well, then you have got a foundation to say, okay, actually this has been relatively successful. This is what we've seen so far, and you've got to be able to show the patient what you think the benefit to them of them being part of that study is. Because if it's more risk than it is benefit, it won't get through ethics anyway. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I got you. Thank you. Sorry, the question's not great, to be fair, because that basically solves it.
Solve your own question.
No, it's a good point, because I think sometimes, if you have got a study it's a difficult, if you're finding that the choice is difficult because patients don't like one of the options, you're starting to answer your research question. So it gets to a point where if you're not able to consent, you're getting some of those feasibility answers through. You're getting that data of patients don't like this idea. So actually its uptake and its use as a treatment is not good. So it sort of starts to answer the question, perhaps not in the way that you thought it was going to, but if it's not acceptable to patients, it's not going to run in clinical practice, so it's not going to happen.
I mean, we do have that with some of our studies, that we have a really high proportion of patients who say no because of training. That's not what patients want.
Yeah.
But you're right, that is then answering the research question, but in a different way.
Yeah.
I suppose it's not then necessarily able to answer that question, is this treatment better than another? But actually it's saying patients want this because they don't want to even sign up to the study in the first place.
Yeah.
You should pay them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's all different studies that are done about approaching patients, and qualitative studies that have, like the active trial, they've been involved in doing dictaphone recordings when I'm speaking to patients, so that they've recorded what I've said to patients and what the patient's questions have been. And so they've done that in different sites so everyone that gets approached, they get asked, we're going to talk to you about this study, is it okay if we record this conversation? Because then they're evaluating the different quality of information that's being passed on, what kind of questions the patient's coming back with. And it's like quite a good sense check of whether or not that's being delivered in a way that the trial team anticipated as well.
I suppose that's almost something that you want to do in a feasibility trial, before you do a full-scale, multi-centred trial, to say, how do patients take this? Almost like kind of alongside your PPI, saying, what do patients actually think about this?
And it's essentially the main role for a reason why you do feasibility, and it's also the reason why you monitor recruitment, you monitor reasons for people saying no, and you monitor AEs and complications, because then when patients ask you, okay, well, how many patients have done this and how many patients have been okay, then you can start giving them some information. But
that's quite a useful thing to know when going to speak to a patient about trial as well, like how many people are on the trial overall.
Like we had someone this morning ask us how many people are doing this study.
In right line overall, but a lot here. Not many.
That's in there.
I think they've got about 500 in.
300 something. Mine is like, I can't remember, it's either 359 or 539.
So when we're looking on the website, their total target is 1,000 and something there, almost at halfway.
So I said the lower number, just in case that.
Yeah. They check it up and they're like,
Yeah. Go high.
Does anyone have any other questions or anything they want to talk about? Feel free.
I think we could talk all day about examples of.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying not to like use my examples. I'm trying.
Or what about in that chart, the timeline? Can we look at that?
Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, go to GCP training. just do it. That. Yeah, I didn't really talk this through, so I've read quite a lot about these random things, so feel free to ask about them.
I remember doing a different ethics training before and finding it interesting, obviously, like where the Declaration of Helsinki came from, the fact that it came from all of the very dodgy underground research that was done during the war.
Yeah.
Where basically they had people that were very undocumented, because they were going to kill anyway, that they did a lot of research on.
Yeah.
Where actually we found out loads of stuff that we now know, like the lowest temperature that your body can survive at before you die. That's really, really awful things. That now looking back, like there's absolutely no chance that anything like that would get through any ethical approval. But that's why it was all developed.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's all those. So there was a Nuremberg Code. That was the start of it, because they had obviously the World War II trials. The thing is, I think sometimes like the big high-profile things that people know about, because this sort of stuff is done all over the world. Like, there's pretty much not a country that gets away with it, like, of not doing something dodgy. Like, it's the ones that sort of popped up were quite a few American ones, but you know, there are sort of problems all over the place, really.
Why is Dolly up there? Is that just because it's sort of new ground?
I put Dolly up there because she raised quite a lot of controversy, and actually there was a Japanese scientist, I think, I can't quite remember, who modified the genome of some babies to make them resistant to HIV, and there was quite a lot of outrage. I think it was just around the time of Dolly the sheep, and I don't remember really hearing about that, but apparently there was that perpetuated a big discussion about what should humans be doing and what should they be tinkering with when it comes to genetics, because obviously something like cloning a person, and they have cloned embryos, but they haven't allowed clones of humans to be done, which, yeah, I mean, she just, this is an odd thing. I just remember when that happened, we were like, what? Why? Why did you do that? Like, just because you could? Like, personally, I don't know, I just didn't really get why it would be done, but I guess it's kind of linked with some of the stem cell, being able to have sort of like the ability to develop types of cells that you might need for treatments. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I can say. Yeah, I just found it quite shocking that the MMR paper was retracted in 2010. So we had 12 years of that thing lingering around before it was actually formally retracted.
And you think about the damage that that's done.
Yeah.
In the general public, even though it's quite widely known that paper was retracted.
Yeah.
I think that consensus of it still remains.
Well, I think it's an interesting point that if you've got somebody who's meant to be really highly regarded and trusted, who carries out something that's published in the Lancet, and then 10 years later that gets proven to be wrong or, malpractice, very difficult to not understand why people, sorry, that's double negative, but it's very difficult to sort of tell people, oh, but this research is okay. You can understand where that fear and that cynicism comes from, because for people to pick out what is genuine and what's been followed to the letter is not a simple thing.
And I think it's like it almost kind of fits alongside a general media issue that we're only going to hear about the negative stories. Like obviously at the moment we're hearing a bit more with COVID of this study has proven this drug's been successful, etc. But generally we hear more about the negative things that have happened. And then all of that kind of trickles into patients' general knowledge.
And that's why I think information, you know, as much kind of chance for them to be able to just read through things and understand what it is, where you're coming from, and what. Not everybody will have necessarily, that's one of my pet things about health literacy, not everyone will be able to have that ability to process all of that. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we give them as much opportunity to give it to them in a format that that person can make that decision and feel confident that they've understood all the ins and outs of it. Because it's easy to assume that everyone has the same level of health sort of understanding as we do. And that would be like me going to my husband's work and designing their conditioning system. Like, it's just, no, I got this. Yeah.
I remember going to approach a patient for, I think it was for fame, and saying like, oh, I'm on the research team, do you mind if I like explain to you about a study, you're happy for me to talk to you? And he was like, I'm going to stop you, I already know what you're going to say. I was like, okay, somebody already explained it to me. He was like, it's going to be about stem cells, isn't it? And I was like, no, it's nothing about stem cells. But again, interesting like insight into his view of that any research is obviously like,
I
about
only
stem
see
cells.
like the role of research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, if there's no other questions, then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Bye, everyone. Hope you're okay.
Thank you. Bye bye.